Seriously? Jimenez was from Quito and had no place of his own where he could put up the girls in Guayaquil. He himself hired a room at the Hotel El Dorado, the same room which would later be occupied by Selena McIntosh and her dogs. On the advice of police, he took the girls to an orphanage next door to the cathedral downtown, where nuns gladly accepted responsibility for them. There was still plenty of food for everyone. Jimenez then went to the hotel and he told the story to the bartender there, who was Jesus Ortiz, the same man who would later disconnect all the telephones from the outside world. So Jimenez was one aviator who had quite a lot to do with the future of humanity. And another one was an American named Paul W. Tibbets. It was Tibbets who had dropped an atomic bomb on Hisako Hiraguchi's mother during World War II. People would probably be as furry as they are today even if Tibbets hadn't dropped the bomb. But they certainly got furrier faster because of him. The orphanage put out a call for anybody who could speak Cancabono to serve as an interpreter. An old drunk and petty thief appeared, a purebred white man who, amazingly, was a grandfather of the lightest of the girls. When a youngster, he had gone prospecting for valuable minerals in the rainforest and had lived with the Cancabonos for 3 years. He had welcomed Father Fitzgerald to the tribe when the priest first arrived from Ireland. His name was Domingo Quisera, and he was from excellent stock. His father had been head of the philosophy department of the Central University in Quito. If they were so inclined then, people today might claim to be descended from a long line of aristocratic Spanish intellectuals. When I was a little boy in Cojos and could detect nothing in the life of our little family about which I could be proud, my mother told me that I had the blood of French noblemen flowing in my veins. I would probably be living in a chateau on a vast estate over there, she said, if it hadn't been for the French Revolution. That was on her side of the family. I was also somehow related through her, she went on, to Carter Braxton, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. I should hold my head up high, she said, because of the blood flowing in my veins. I thought that was pretty good. So then I disturbed my father at his typewriter and asked him what my heritage was from his side of the family. I didn't know then what sperm was, and so wouldn't understand his answer for several years. My boy, he said, you are descended from a long line of determined, resourceful, microscopic tadpoles, champions, every one. You know I gotta highlight that. Old Quiseta, stinking like a battlefield, told the girls that they could trust only him, which was easy enough for them to believe since he was the grandfather of one and the only person who would converse with them. They had to believe everything he said. They were without the means to be skeptical since their new environment had nothing in common with the rainforest. They had many truths they were prepared to defend stubbornly and proudly, but none of them applied to anything they had so far seen in Guayaquil, except for one, a classically fatal belief in urban areas a million years ago. Relatives would never want to hurt them. Quiseta, in fact, wished to expose them to terrible dangers as thieves and beggars, and, as soon as was remotely possible, as prostitutes. He would do this in order to feed his big brain's thirst for self-esteem and alcohol. He was at last going to be a man of wealth and importance. He took the girls on walks around the city, showing them as far as the nuns at the orphanage were aware of the parks and the cathedral and the museums and so on. He was in fact teaching them what was hateful about tourists and where to find them and how to fool them and where they were most likely to keep their valuables. And they played the game of spotting policemen before policemen spotted them and memorizing good hiding places in the downtown area, should any enemy try to catch them. It was just pretend for the girls' first week in the city, but then Grandfather Domingo Quiseta and the girls, as far as the nuns and the police were concerned, vanished entirely. That vile old ancestor of all humanity had moved the girls into an empty shed by the waterfront, A shed, as it happened, belonging to one of the two older cruise ships with which the Bahia de Darwin was meant to compete. The shed was empty because tourism had declined to the point where the old ship was out of business. At least the girls had each other, and during their early years on Santa Rosalia, until Mary Hepburn made them the gift of babies, that was what they were most grateful for. At least they had each other, their own language and their own religious beliefs and jokes and songs and so on. And that was what they would leave to their children on Santa Rosalia when they entered one by one the blue tunnel into the afterlife. The comforts of at least having each other, and the Kankabono language, and the Kankabono religion, and the Kankabono jokes and songs. During their bad old days in Guayaquil, old Quezada offered his stinking body for their experimentation as he taught them, as little as they were, the fundamental skills and attitudes of prostitutes. They were certainly in need of rescue long before the economic crisis. Yes, in one dusty window of the shed, which was their gruesome schoolhouse, framed the stern of the Bahia de Darwin right outside. Little did they know that that beautiful white ship would soon be their Noah's Ark. The girls finally ran away from the old man. They began to live in the streets, still begging and stealing, but for reasons they could not understand, tourists became harder and harder to find, and at last there didn't seem to be anything to eat anywhere. They were truly hungry now as they approached simply anyone, opening their mouths wide and rolling their eyes and pointing down their little throats to show how long it had been since they had eaten. And late one afternoon, they were attracted by the sounds of the crowd around the El Dorado. They found that the back door of a shuttered shop was open, and out came Geraldo Delgado, who had just shot Andrew McIntosh and Zenji Hiraguchi. So they went into the shop and out of the front door. They were inside the barrier set up by the soldiers, so there was nobody to stop them from entering the El Dorado, where they would throw themselves on the mercy of James Waite in the cocktail lounge. Mary Hepburn was meanwhile murdering herself up in her room, lying on her bed with the polyethylene sheath of her Jackie dress wrapped around her head. The sheath was now all steamed up inside, and she hallucinated that she was a great land tortoise lying on its back in the hot and humid hold of a sailing ship of long ago. She pawed the air in perfect futility, just as a land tortoise on its back would have done. As she had often told her students, sailing ships bound out across the Pacific used to stop off in the Galapagos Islands to capture defenseless tortoises who could live on their backs without food or water for months. They were so slow and tame and huge and plentiful. Sailors would capsize them without fear of being bitten or clawed. Then they would drag them down to waiting longboats on the shore, using the animals' own useless suits of armor for sleds. They would store them on their backs in the dark, paying no further attention to them until it was time for them to be eaten. The beauty of the tortoises to the sailors was that they were fresh meat, which did not have to be refrigerated or eaten right away. Every school year back in Ilium, Mary could count on some students being outraged that human beings should have treated such trusting creatures so cruelly. This gave her the opportunity to say that the natural order had dealt harshly with such tortoises long before there was such an animal as man. There used to be millions of them lumbering over every temperate land mass of any size, she would say. But then some tiny animals evolved into rodents. These easily found and ate the eggs of the tortoises, all of the eggs. So very quickly, that was that for the tortoises everywhere, except for those on a few islands which remained rodent-free. It was prophetic that Mary should imagine herself to be a land tortoise as she suffocated, since something very much like what had happened to most of the land tortoises so long ago was then beginning to happen to most of humankind. Some new creature, invisible to the naked eye, was eating up all the eggs in human ovaries, starting at the annual book fair at Frankfurt, Germany. Women at the fair were experiencing a slight fever, which came and went in a day or two, and sometimes blurry vision. After that, they would be just like Mary Hepburn. They couldn't have babies anymore. Nor would any way be discovered for stopping this disease. It would spread practically everywhere. The near extinction of mighty land tortoises by little rodents was certainly a David and Goliath story. Now here was another one. Yes, and Mary came close enough to death to see the blue tunnel into the afterlife. At that point, she rebelled against her big brain, which had brought her that far. She unwrapped the garment bag from her head, and instead of dying, she went downstairs, where she found James Waite feeding peanuts and olives and maraschino cherries and cocktail onions from behind the bar to the 6 Kenkabono girls. This tableau of clumsy charity would remain imprinted in her brain for the rest of her life. She would believe ever after that he was an unselfish, compassionate, lovable human being. He was about to suffer a fatal heart attack, so nothing would ever happen to revise her high opinion of this loathsome man. On top of everything else, this man was a murderer. His murder had gone like this. He was a homosexual prostitute on the island of Manhattan, and a bloated plutocrat picked him up in a bar, asking him if he realized that the price tag was still on the hem of his lovely new blue velour shirt. This man had royal blood in his veins. This was Prince Richard of Croatia-Slavonia, a direct descendant of James I of England and Emperor Frederick III of Germany, and Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria and King Louis XV of France. He ran an antique shop on Upper Madison Avenue, and he wasn't homosexual. He wanted young Waite to strangle him with a silken sash from his dressing gown, and then to loosen the sash after having brought him as close as possible to death. Prince Richard had a wife and 2 children who were on a skiing vacation in Switzerland, and his wife was young enough to be ovulating still. So young, Waite may have prevented yet another carrier of those noble genes from being born. There was this, too. If Prince Richard hadn't been murdered, he and his wife might have been invited by Bobby King to take part in the nature cruise of the century. His widow would become a very successful designer of neckties, calling herself Princess Charlotte, although she was a commoner, the daughter of a Staten Island roofer, and not entitled to that rank or the use of his coat of arms. That crest nonetheless appeared on every tie she designed. The late Andrew McIntosh owned several Princess Charlotte ties. Waite spread-eagled this porky, chinless blue blood face up on a 4-poster bed, which the prince said had belonged to Eleanor of Palatinate-Neuburg, the mother of King Joseph I of Hungary. Waite tied him to the thick posts with nylon ropes already cut to length. These had been stored in a secret drawer under the flounce at the foot of the bed. This was an old drawer and had one time concealed secrets of the sex life of Eleanor of Palatinate-Neuburg. "Tie me nice and tight so I can't get away," Prince Richard told young Waite, "but don't cut off the circulation. I would hate to get gangrene." His big brain had him doing this at least once a month for the past 3 years. hiring strangers to tie him up and strangle him just a little bit. What a survival scheme. Prince Richard of Croatia-Slavonia, possibly with the ghosts of his progenitors looking on, instructed young James Waite to strangle him to the point where he lost consciousness. Then Waite, whom he knew only as Jimmy, was to count slowly to 20 in this manner. 1001, 1002, and so on. Possibly with King James and Emperor Frederick and Emperor Franz Joseph and King Louis looking on, the prince, one of several claimants to the throne of Yugoslavia, warned Jimmy not to touch any part of his body or clothing, save for the sash around his neck. He would experience orgasm, but Jimmy was not to attempt to enhance that event with his mouth or hands. "I am not a homosexual," he said, "and I've hired you as a sort of valet, not as a prostitute. This may be hard for you to believe, Jimmy," he went on, "if you lead the kind of life I think you lead, but this is a spiritual experience for me, so keep it spiritual. Otherwise, no $100 tip. Do I make myself clear? I am an unusual man." He didn't tell Waite about it, but his big brain put on quite a movie for him while he was unconscious. It showed him one end of a writhing piece of blue tubing, about 5 meters in diameter, big enough to drive a truck through, and lit up inside like the funnel of a tornado. It did not roar like a tornado, however. Instead, unearthly music, as though from a glass harmonica, came from the far end, which appeared to be about 50 meters away. Depending on how the tube twisted, Prince Richard could catch glimpses of the opening in the far end, a golden dot, and hints of greenery. This, of course, was the tunnel into the afterlife. So Waite put a small rubber ball into the mouth of this would-be liberator of the Yugoslavs, as he had been told to do, and sealed the mouth with a pre-cut piece of adhesive tape, which had been stuck to a bedpost. Then he strangled the prince, cutting off the blood supply to his big brain and the air supply to his lungs. Instead of counting slowly to 20 after the prince lost consciousness and had his orgasm and saw the writhing tube, he counted slowly to 300 instead. That was 5 minutes. It was Waite's big brain's idea. It wasn't anything he himself had particularly wanted to do. If he had ever been brought to trial for the murder or the manslaughter or whatever the government chose to call this crime, he would probably have pleaded temporary insanity. He would have claimed that his big brain simply wasn't working right at the time. There wasn't a person alive a million years ago who didn't know what that was like. Apologies for momentary brain failures were the staple of everybody's conversations. "Whoops. Excuse me. I hope you're not hurt. I can't believe I did that. It happened so fast I didn't have time to think. I have insurance against this kind of thing. And how can I ever forgive myself? And I didn't know it was loaded," and on and on. There were beads and dollops of human sperm on the prince's crested satin sheets, full of royal tadpoles racing each other to nowhere, as young Waite let himself out of the triple apartment on Sutton Place. He hadn't stolen anything, and he hadn't left any fingerprints. The doorman of the building, who had seen him coming and going, was able to tell the police very little about his appearance, save that he was young and white and slender, and wore a blue velour shirt from which the price tag had not been removed. And there was something prophetic, too, in those millions of royal tadpoles on a satin sheet with no place meaningful to go. The whole world, as far as human sperm was concerned, with the exception of the Galapagos Islands, was about to become like that satin sheet. Dare I add this, in the nick of time?